Welcome to the Nine Line Podcast. I'm your host, Ethan Nagel, and today we are joined by Nick Laidlaw. He's a Marine Infantry veteran, author of What War Did to Us. He's the account admin, or you'd say the founder of Battles and Beers Instagram account. And then he also, during his day job, helps autistic kids with, I believe, learning disabilities and whatnot. So, Nick, thanks for coming on the show. I hope I didn't butcher that too much, but I have your book right here. I wanted to make sure I brought it for everybody. So far, I'm working my way through it, but I read a lot of the stories on your Instagram on Battles and Beers before that. So my sister-in-law picked that up for me for Christmas. I'm excited to finish that. But yeah, let's jump into it. And what is, where'd you come from? What's your background? And where'd you grow up?
Well, first off, thanks for having me, man. It's a pleasure to be here. Always enjoy talking about what I do. A little about myself. I graduated high school 2012. 6 days later, was off to boot camp, San Diego. My Marine Corps career was not, I guess it wasn't really what I signed up for, like that whole generation of Marines. If you came in 2011 to 2017, 18, you'll know what I'm talking about. The very tail end of the GWAT, trained for this war that we really weren't going to get to go to. And so, I did a couple deployments, nowhere really special, worth talking about, and it left me kind of feeling a little empty, like unfulfilled. And so I was always the history guy growing up. I remember being in third grade history class, like reading textbooks for fun, And I remember one of my first obsessions was the American Civil War. And so just right off the bat, I was always interested in like the first person perspective of people in combat and in wars. And so after the Marine Corps, my buddy Ricky Polina and I tried to start our own podcast. It wasn't successful, but it was the start of something. And so we had a small group of guys helping, and kind of one by one, they all just kind of fell off and like did their own things. Everyone who was involved is like doing something separate now, living their best life, But I'm the one who kind of stayed with B&B, and it was dead for a little bit. And then I started posting like excerpts from books, like from Vietnam by Andrew Weist, or Voices of the Pacific by Adam Makos, like little firsthand account, like little snippets of what it was like to participate in historical battles. And then in the comment section, people would comment their own stories. So like a lot of GWAT guys, some Gulf War, people from all over the world. And so I thought, okay, like there's a bunch of undocumented stories out there. I think I'm going to try to be the guy to gather them. And so I wouldn't really consider myself like a journalist or even an author. I would consider myself to be more of like a carrier pigeon, where I'm just gathering stories from one place and then just bringing them to another place just to solidify it.
Yeah, absolutely. So then what years was that then? Like what years were you in, and then what? Yeah. So go from there. And then, what was the years that Battles and Beers kind of started, even in its infancy as a podcast, or what you guys were doing?
Yep. So I was active duty from 2012 to 2017, and then I did 3 years in the reserves after 2017. And so Battles and Beers kind of was in its infancy in, like, I would say March of 2018. And it originally started out as like a Facebook page and a very small Instagram page. And then it just grew and grew from there until, like, I believe now it's like 139,000 followers. So it's been a long process of building the following and building the trust, especially because I offer anonymity with a lot of my stories. And so, like, if you don't want to be named, or what unit you were in, or even what front line you're at, like, you can still get your story documented and uploaded, and people can read what you experienced without your name attached to it. So that definitely attracts a lot more people. It attracts some fakes out there too, but that's for the audience to sort out.
Yeah. So like you said, for the initial, how many were there initially for you guys?
Followers or like
Or
guys working
sorry,
on
like
B&B?
guys working on it. Yeah, yeah, like your buddies.
It was originally Ricky and I, and then we brought on like two or three more guys after that, just to
Hmm.
try different things with the podcast. But turns out podcasting is a lot of work,
Yeah.
and we were all college students at the time, and I'm still going to school at the same time. Like in addition to all of this, I'm still a full time student going online, and
Oh no shit! Like right now, currently.
yep, right now currently,
Oh wow,
yep. Like during my last trip to Ukraine, I was doing English homework at the same time, and so yeah.
that's
Um,
awesome.
but yeah, so there was originally two, and then it just kind of whittled down to just me. So at its smallest was two guys, and then largest was five, and now it's myself. And then I've got like a co-author slash translator, Ilya.
Hmm.
He's actually in the Marine Corps Reserves as well, and he's like my Russian Ukrainian language specialist. And so I rely on him a lot to translate. Like, okay, this needs to be translated like right now stories.
Awesome.
And he
So,
actually wrote the foreword for my book as well.
oh hell yeah, that's awesome.
Mhm.
Yeah. Um. So you're telling these stories, like I said, in the getting out of the Marine Corps, and that's pretty wild that you're doing English homework. Or I mean, recently when you went to Ukraine, we could
Yeah.
definitely dive into that. But so what when you guys initially kind of fired all this up, like I said, podcasting is kind of tough because I know how I can empathize. Like it's, I had my own podcast for about before the pandemic hit actually, and the pandemic hit, and then I was like, oh, no one wants to come on, and I wasn't. Here I am doing over the internet or doing like a Zoom call podcast, and I was never a fan of them, but now it's hey, we got to fire up and do this now, but and it definitely works to gather more guests, but I was definitely like an in-person, like, hey, do that. And that is very tough to do, especially if you are, even with my friends, they'd come over and the post-production time was, way more than what you expect it to be,
Mhm.
and eating up data rates and whatnot, depending on what cameras you're using. But, um, yeah. So when did the momentum start picking up then for Battles and Beers that you're like, hey, this is something that I mean, it's a pretty significant piece of history, and that's, I think, in my opinion, but also in the followers' opinions, I think there isn't really a page out there like that. So when did the ball kind of get rolling? You're like, I think this is something bigger than what I expected it to be.
Um, so a little over like a year and a half ago, I guess, I started doing completely like I would upload interviews only conducted by myself.
Hmm.
And so I stopped taking bits and pieces from books, and it was all just stories that I procured myself.
Hmm.
And at that point was when I kind of realized like I have something different from everyone else because this is only content that I am creating. Or I'm not
Hmm.
creating it, but like I am gathering it from sources that I find. Um, when B&B actually kind of like started growing like exponentially was during the initial phases of the invasion of Ukraine. Like that
Hmm.
first night, I think I got like 10,000 followers um, on the evening of the 24th. And
Hmm.
I owe a lot of that, I think, to Cossack Gundy or Aiden Aslin. Um, I befriended him on Instagram in like June of like 2021.
Hmm.
I saw that he was this guy in Ukraine, like the in the Marines there, and I don't know what you want to call it, like typical American attitude. I had no idea that like this conflict was even going on in Ukraine. Like I
Hmm.
remember being in the Marine Corps in 2014 and having no idea that like Crimea had just been annexed. You know,
Hmm.
and so I befriended Aiden Aslin and then documented a few of his stories. And then after that, like in December, like November, December, like the Russian forces started amassing on the border of Ukraine. And I thought, okay, like I have a really strong feeling that this war is gonna happen. And
Hmm.
so I better start establishing like a list of contacts while I can. And so I just went on YouTube videos, message boards, went on all over Reddit looking for like Instagram accounts or YouTube pages of people who were in Ukraine already. And the majority of them were civilians. A couple of them were soldiers. Like right off the bat, like a lot of people were really hesitant to talk because I was still like a small page.
Hmm.
Um, and I noticed like people are much more willing to talk to a big page than a small one. So those
Yeah.
small independent journalists out there who have like less than 10,000 followers, like keep going.
Hmm.
Just keep at it. You'll get there. Um, and so I started building all these contacts and interviewing them on like their thoughts on an upcoming invasion. And then I'll argue I was probably within the first 100 Westerners outside of our government to know that Russia had crossed the border into Ukraine, because like right off the bat, I had Marines um, like in the 36th Marine Brigade near Mariupol, and other soldiers in the Donetsk
Hmm.
Oblast, and all the like the whole Eastern Front. I was getting messages like it started, like it's happening, and so
Yeah.
I just went to work right away documenting like what are you seeing, what's going on. Those soldiers at the front relayed me to their families, like in Kharkiv or Kherson,
Hmm.
Kiev, and all those places. And I was up that entire like 40-hour period
Hmm.
of the Russians launching their assault, just documenting stuff and uploading it as I got it.
Hmm.
Like typically, I only try to upload once or twice a day, but in
Hmm.
that case, I was just getting such a huge influx of stories that it was as I got them. So I would upload a story, interview someone else, 10 minutes later, upload another story,
Hmm.
and that's when the page like really started to grow. There's a lot of like viral stories that got passed around there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like, especially, we can definitely jump into that, like Ukraine. I mean, I have the same experience too. Like, I was going to your guys' type of pages, and Atlas, I think Atlas News is one of them. There's a Rose Warfare,
Yep.
because those guys are the ones that we relied upon during the Afghan evac, going back and forth, and there's a lot of people that helped with that, like coordination efforts. So I do remember, we started looking at their pages like, hey, what's going on? And it, obviously Twitter is, and like I never jumped into, I had Twitter for years, never looked at it, like never, you know dove in, just, it was kind of, I never liked the formatting of it, but I knew Instagram was moving very quickly, and I obviously know Twitter's a little faster, so I started paying attention to Twitter a little bit more. But I do remember Twitter during the Arab Spring back in 2010-11 being a key component on trying to basically disseminate, get information out there. And that's pretty wild though. I mean, like I said, everyone's turning to you that have made contacts. And you talk about Aiden, and that was the thing is Aiden, I remember the starting to follow him because he fought in Iraq. He was
Yeah, he was in the YPG.
yeah, he was in YPG. So I followed a few of those guys back in 14 because I was like, man, I kind of wanted to go as a journalist. I was in film school. If I didn't want to go fight, I wasn't as like, my heart wasn't as much as like Afghanistan. Like Iraq, I'm very much like, whatever, they can figure it out. But like, but it was seeing guys in my generation and guys I served with like go over and do that. And I thought that was pretty awesome. And I thought that'd be like a really cool thing to go do with not so much as a school project, but head over there as like a journalist. But yeah, I
Mhm.
think, seeing your guys' page and seeing like what you're documenting in those early hours, then, you know, how did you feel? Like, what was, did the Ukrainians at all give you a sense of like how this was going to go? Like, are we going to fall? Are we going to, are we going to persevere through for the next few weeks? Like, what was that tone? What was that like in that first 40 hours?
So I think the majority of people agree that when we first saw like Russian tanks and stuff in Ukraine, I remember thinking like, okay, I got to work fast because this is going to be over pretty quick.
Hmm.
Like in a couple days, like Zelensky's not going to be here anymore. There's going to be a different flag flying over the government buildings in Kiev, and
Hmm.
like the Ukrainian army is not going to be the Ukrainian army anymore.
Hmm.
But I remember all the soldiers that I talked to were like, yeah, it's probably going to be over quick, but I'm not going to give up. Like
Hmm.
this is our country. We have a right to sovereignty, and like I will fight and die defending that. And I think that attitude across the board
Hmm.
is a big reason of what saved Ukraine in those early weeks. Was just the fighting spirit. You know, people can
Hmm.
say like you can have all these weapons and stuff, but unless you have like guys with balls who are willing to like stand there and say, okay, like they're not going to cross this point, then um, then what's the point? You know, like there, I
Yeah.
documented a lot of the fighting in the village of Mashun, which is
Hmm.
very early in the war. There was some pretty savage fighting there, and and it was just that like I always compare it to like that Churchill spirit. Like
Hmm.
these guys, they know like they're outgunned, but they're still going in there anyway and
Hmm.
defending their country as best they can. And I think that played a major role in what kept Ukraine in the fight, as well as the early support from the West and the Western fighters
Hmm.
as well. I remember there's this huge influx of Westerners who wanted to go to Ukraine. Most of them didn't stay or fight at all, but I think the
Hmm.
the support was there.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I said it. We talked. I think when was the first time we linked up? Probably what, May, April or May. Um,
Yeah.
because I was still at my old house and we still lived there. I moved
Mhm.
a few months ago, but yeah, I think that was something that you saw that was different. I think for guys of us in the GWAT, seeing Afghanistan fall apart, it's like seeing the Ukrainians and then seeing this conventional warfare just break out. Like it's I never would think I never thought I would see it in my lifetime. We always talk about that. I mean, like your infantry, that is like our, we they train us in infantry tactics and in conventional warfare. And the GWAT, even though it was around for 20 years, it was always an afterthought, coin operations, because it's,
Yeah.
like, yeah, you can, it's, you still got to know the basics. And honestly, that still pushes forward into counterinsurgency operations. It's always like a branch, like, hey, conventional warfare, now unconventional, but you still have to know the basics. And I think seeing that, starting to play out in our lifetime, and then it's, I think, you know, everyone was just taken aback because they're like, holy shit, people are still willing to do this. Not so much that Ukrainians are willing to fight, but like Russia's willing to invade a sovereign country. You know, um, you know, I think Afghanistan left a bad taste in everybody's mouth, and then, when you saw Ukraine kick off, you're just like, God damn it, I hope, like I hope they do well, because kind of, just the whole fighting spirit, and trying to do what's right. You kind of see, Afghanistan fall apart. You wanted a win for the good guys, and so Ukraine just start fucking, duking it out. And I remember those first few, like 2-3 days, were just tense as shit. My wife
Yeah.
could attest to that. I was starting to get back on the horn with all the network that I had built during the Afghan evac, and like I said, within 3 weeks we were on ground. So I know how, just that feeling of like, hey, can we go and try and help, and what can we do before it falls? Because I agree with you. I think we all were just like, hey, let's try to evacuate as many people as we can before it falls. Like,
Hmm.
what can we do? Can we, build the networks, get them supplies and logistics? And then by the time we got there, which was only 3 weeks into the war, it still felt that way. In Lviv, it was a big fighting spirit, and it's like I said, I always tell people, I haven't felt that since 9/11, 9/12. And it was just this amazing feeling of just like, holy shit, of camaraderie. You're just helping. Every move you made, helped the guys on the front line, like gathering up med kits and then getting them off. I was throwing garbage bags to a random guy on, to because someone else had contacted me to be like, we need these med kits, can you get them to this guy at this time? Like, yep. And I threw it to him and he took off, and like, they're like, yep, we got him, like 3-4 days later on signal.
Hmm.
So yeah, I mean, you know, capturing that type of history. Now we can kind of backtrack a little bit. So, I mean, I think it's amazing that this is playing out in real time, and I think it's crazy that there is social media and you're documenting all these stories. Going back into Battles and Beers, you had contacted other fighters from previous wars. What was that like? Kind of conducting those first stories before Ukraine kicked off. Like going back to, you said, Vietnam, and talking to
Yep.
the old timers.
So most, I would say, I've interviewed at least someone from most wars since World War II.
Yeah.
Um, and I've spoken to German soldiers, Japanese soldiers, former NVA, Viet Cong. I've even spoken to some like Republican Guard guys
Hmm.
from Iraq, like both sides of like basically any war. And I always found talking to the other side a bit more. It's a little more challenging because
Hmm.
they're not like the conventional good guy from the Western point of view.
Yeah.
And like speaking to a lot of these people, I knew like as I'm like writing down what they're saying, like it's going to make a lot of Western people mad. Um,
Yeah.
but I guess that was kind of the point of it, was to not document like what people wanted to hear, but what happened.
Hmm.
Um, and I documented a lot of stories from a lot of different people, like in the Rhodesian Bush War,
Hmm.
some Russian soldiers from the Soviet-Afghan War, and then one of my favorite wars to document was the First and Second Chechen War.
Hmm.
Um, I spoke to a lot of former Russian soldiers there, and then as well as like two former Chechen fighters as
Hmm.
well. And it was just kind of, I would say, my work back then was very, I would say very amateurish. I asked not all the questions I think I should have. I think there were a lot of interviews that I conducted where I could have gotten a little more sustenance out of them, but I consider that like as good practice
Hmm.
for this war in
Hmm.
Ukraine. Because by then it was, I wasn't like in, because I was always a shy guy
Hmm.
up to this. Like I said, I just kind of fell into doing B&B, and so I consider that as like really good practice to conduct interviews now,
Hmm.
especially like in an ongoing war.
Hmm.
And documenting stories in an ongoing war is really, it's really difficult sometimes. I probably shouldn't do this, but I get pretty emotionally invested in a
Hmm.
lot of the people that I interview, especially like we'll call them like returning customers. So it's like guys
Hmm.
who I form a relationship with, and then they experience like another firefight that has some interesting stuff in it, and they'll come back and tell me about it. And so
Hmm.
it's like, instead of like this professional relationship I build with them, it becomes more of a friendship.
Hmm.
Um, and because of the nature of an ongoing war, some of them never come back online, and
Hmm.
then a lot of them, they're not here anymore. And
Hmm.
so like the book, in a way, is to me like an obituary of sorts.
Hmm.
Um, Doc Snickers, Greg,
Hmm.
um, he was recently killed in Bakhmut,
Hmm.
and that was just like another like nail in the coffin for me of like, okay, like what I'm doing is important,
Hmm.
because like he's gone, but like a written record of what he experienced is here forever.
Hmm.
And so yeah, I'll always be grateful for those couple years before this war
Hmm.
of like practice for documenting, because it really gave me the tools and the skill set and the confidence really to just reach out and like talk to people.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's I mean, it's pretty challenging. I mean, like, imagine that's pretty easy to do, get emotionally connected. I mean, especially as war fighters, you understand the pain, you understand what they're trying to do, and sometimes it's almost frustrating because you want, like I said, I know we feel the pull of like trying to fight and alongside them or join them, and I mean, that was the same way when I didn't even know Aiden, but I had followed him, and there we are watching Maripol, like rooting for him, and it was crazy because then you start reaching out and, you know, you're seeing these. We had a guy that we had connected with he was in Maripol, and I think it was Maripol or one of the coastal cities, and it was early on. He was killed within 2 weeks. We were trying to get to him because he had trained with our former company commander in Lima Company back in 2006. Or I mean, like, so our company commander in Iraq, 2006, Captain Hudson, trained with him years later in like like 2011, 2012 time frame. And this was, years ago, but he started reaching out and we got in contact with him. So here I know how you feel. I'm texting him being like, what do you need? How can we get this ball rolling? Like what supplies can we get to you? Can we even get to you? And then he's like, we're surrounded. This is, and then three, he goes radio silent, and then, you get the worst. He's like, hey, he's been killed. And I think that was such a crazy thing to, and like I said, you're going through that with all these interviews, especially with all these fighters that, but at least in the close, I always say, it's awesome what you're doing because you are giving a voice and a story and insight into what's going on, you know, all the way up to, I won't say up to their death, but what they've been doing, like we didn't have that even in the GWAT, other than guys that have survived and then that go on to tell the stories. But, some of us haven't told stories, because you very much, you want to do the silent professional thing. You remember them through your friends, but, having like some of these instances where it's not like a giant, award-winning firefight, but it's just how they felt and how, things went down before they pass. And I think, I would have loved that for my friends, or even the guys in Vietnam or Desert Storm or World War II. How many of those stories, like you watch Band of Brothers and you're like, there's like 30 characters. Like, how do you come up
Mm-hmm.
with these stories? I'm sure obviously it's very much creative license, but imagine if you had words from, people hadn't seen them for 2 years, 3 years, like, because they were gone off fighting in Europe. So at what, it would have been nice to have something that was like, hey, this is, how I'm feeling, what I'm doing, especially not being uploaded in real time. And I got to imagine that emotionally takes a toll, but especially what you're doing, it's admirable, and especially being able to put those into volumes and in a conventional war in Europe that's currently going on, in Eastern Europe. So, so what was not to completely switch topics on you, but like in that same vein, what is that like? You said it was challenges interviewing, the enemy per se from previous wars that we have been taught, in our classrooms, like the Viet Cong or the Taliban. Like how was it? Like what are some that stick out to you? Some of the stories that you captured.
One of the biggest ones that stick out to me was, I think, an interview I'm very fortunate to conduct, and I haven't published it anywhere yet, but it's from a Mr. Meckling. I won't say his first name yet, but he was
Mm-hmm.
a German survivor of the Battle of Stalingrad. He was one of the
Oh shit.
5,000 who survived. He was one of the 90,000 that survived the battle and one of the 5,000 that survived captivity.
Mm-hmm.
And he grew up across the street from me, or I grew up across the street from him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, had no idea until many years later, and interviewed him a few weeks before he died. And I always, speaking to him makes me think of a Dan Carlin quote where it's, sometimes the evil henchman and the helpless victim are sometimes the same person.
Mm-hmm.
And so, Mr. Meckling, he was part of like the evil German Wehrmacht and
Mm-hmm.
stuff like that in World War II, and he participated in arguably the worst battle to have ever happened. And he just told me all the time he was thinking about going home. Like he just wanted to go home. He didn't want any part of what was going on while he was fighting for the German army in Stalingrad. And he just told me that he missed the smell of his house. He missed the smell of his mom's garden, and he just wanted to go home. And and I think about that a lot of the time, especially now as I'm seeing like memes and stuff being made of like dead Russian soldiers in Ukraine and
Mm-hmm.
stuff like that. And I just think, like, how many of these guys would just rather be at home right
Mm-hmm.
now? So I definitely try not to let Western perspective and like what is good and what is wrong kind of skew my mission to just document unbiased military history. Right now, it's a lot harder to speak to Russian soldiers. One, because they don't have their phones on them, and two, they're just very hesitant to speak to anyone who speaks English as a first language,
Mm-hmm.
and for good reason too. But yeah, speaking to the other side has always been very interesting because it's not a story that gets told.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like Saving Private Ryan is probably my favorite World War II movie, just because like the action and the story and stuff like that. But I bet you could make an equally as interesting, great story from the perspective of like one of those German infantrymen that that ends up in that same town as like Captain Miller and all of them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something that needs to be told more, is the perspective of the other side. I think that, especially during times of war, like we dehumanize the enemy for logical and understandable reasons. But I think it's also important to understand, like, these are human beings as well.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's a reason they're doing X, Y, and Z. Um, I know you fought in Afghanistan, and I talked after the evacuation of Kabul. I spoke to a former member of the Taliban. Um, I documented a whole bunch of stories from
Mm-hmm.
Marines who were there, and a whole bunch of stories from Afghan civilians who were there. And that's when like another like big bump in following came
Mm-hmm.
to my page. I went from like 20 to 30,000. And I got like a lot of Afghans messaging me like, "Hey, like I'm wanted by the Taliban. I need help," stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the middle of all of those messages in my DMs, there's one from a guy who had like picture proof that he was, a member at least at one point of the organization.
Mm-hmm.
And so, he just wanted his story told as well. And speaking to him really kind of like solidified that like a lot of like why we do what we do and like the wars we fight is purely dependent upon where we are born.
Mm-hmm.
You know, um, like this guy, I cannot say that I would not have done what he would have done in the
Mm-hmm.
same situation had the roles been reversed. Um, in his case, a family member had been killed by NATO forces when he was a kid. Uh, he wasn't like a hard line believer in like the Taliban ideology, but the best way to get NATO and the United States out of his country was through the Taliban.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what he did. And he fought in like Sangin in like 2011, I
Mm-hmm.
think, and then was like a low level combatant after that. But then, he just told me like I just wanted my country to be liberated from his perspective,
Mm-hmm.
and so like that kind of put into perspective a lot of like there's stories on both sides, and I think it's important to document all of them. Whether I agree with their perspective or not, I guess isn't really important. My goal with B&B is just to document the story and get it on paper, and then people in the audience can make up their own mind about
Mm-hmm.
the morality of whoever's involved.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, like I said, that's pretty wild, and especially, I mean, we dealt with stuff like that all the time in Afghanistan. I mean, we were there for 20 years. You knew guys were playing both sides. It was always this
Mm-hmm.
weird thing in Afghanistan. Iraq. Everybody thinks that Iraq and Afghanistan were the same war, and they're not at all. And years later, because you have Iraq and they're actually doing pretty decent. Like, like say what you will about the invasion, say what you will, etc. ISIS did go through, and we helped them push them out, but they're doing pretty well. Whereas Afghanistan is in fucking shambles. Like it has gone back to the dark ages. Like I'm still in contact with the Terps that we couldn't get out. Especially one I personally served alongside. Like he's stuck there. It's done. It's over. Like visas are canceled. No one's getting out. Like no one's getting approval. Doesn't matter if you had the right amount of time, they're just denying visas. So it's over for them. They're just not getting out. So, it's that weird thing when people are like, oh, it's the same. It's like, no, it's not. You look back at Afghanistan, you kind of see people playing both sides, and then, but to hear the stories, like I said, if some of those guys like that, you're like, I wonder what they think now, especially after it's fall, like a year later, because some of them are like, this isn't what we thought. I guess there was somebody put up, apparently it was a meme, but it was from an actual article. They're just like, this, like the Taliban's like, this is not what we thought it was going to be. Like we
Mm-hmm.
thought we were going to run it like it was in the 90s or it was 30 years ago. It's like, yeah, who do you think propped up the entire economy? Like, who do you know, it was, because I hate to say it. I mean, like you see the result of us not being there, and everyone always wants
Yeah.
us out. And I can see that, but at the same time, I'm like, we never left Japan. We never left Germany for like 70 years. Like, why would they should have ended the war and done it like they did in Iraq, which was like, we're going to keep 5,000 troops on the ground. We're going to keep the bases, and we'll just keep pumping money into this corrupt ass government, because now we do see the result and we will go back. I mean, there will be some operations that happens in Afghanistan eventually in the next few years. Whether probably most likely a change in administration will start pumping that up again, because I think it's a
Mm-hmm.
little bit different than Iraq, where you have, I mean, ISIS is now on the loose, and Taliban's trying to get recognized as a government. I don't think anybody's going to recognize them. It's going to just dive into this huge third world disaster. And then it's weird because then 2 years before that, when we were going to college, everyone had jobs, everything was running smooth as it could be, with a corrupt government like that. But I don't know, it's like you go anywhere else, government's just corrupt, So it's cool here. Like, it's cool, but it's a great to see what the other side thinks, um, especially when
Mm-hmm.
it comes to the Taliban. Like, you know, I was it was funny because I tell people this in my own personal story. You know, it's you know, with my Silver Star battle, like uh, I had drank tea and talked politics and the weather with a man that tried to kill me an hour later. You know, so it's this this weird thing, you know, of like being like, yeah, the person across from me, like, we're gonna try to kill each other in the next hour, but right now we're having tea.
Mm-hmm.
And so being a combat advisor kind of brings that to light a little bit more. Like, you know, most green, you know, it's a Green Beret mission, that's special forces mission, is combat advisors, and that's what we did over there. And I think, you know, it's great seeing you document the other side because it's stuff that we did see. You know, you're kind of like you're not like, hey, I'm on their side. You're still hunting these guys down, but you start to understand a little bit more why they are the way they are and how they operate. You know, and why, you know, they believe in their cause so much, or what the outside influence is, you know, like who's pumping money. You know, some of these guys just want to make a buck, you know, and shoot at you. Sadly, those are the kind of the
Mm-hmm.
guys that we snatch up right away and the smart ones get away, you know, back to Pakistan. But, you know, so was there any others beyond, you know, your next door neighbor, or ones that other, you know, that really captured your attention? Like, I don't want to say horrific stuff, but is there some that they're just like wanting, basically they're like, hey, I just want to get this off my chest, you know, make some
Yeah, there were a
yeah.
couple. Um, Two come to mind immediately. One was a Japanese soldier who remembers giving a merciful death to a bunch of wounded British soldiers. I think it was in Burma, and he's not the one who did it, but he remembers like his like squad leader, platoon commander, one of the two, going around with a bayonet and shoving it into the ears of the wounded British soldiers on the ground. And he thought, okay, like this is, I'm like we're alleviating their suffering,
Mm-hmm.
sort of thing. And speaking to him, it's like talking to people from a time machine,
Mm-hmm.
you know, like from a different time, and in a way, it is. A lot of them never really got past it, and I was very fortunate to speak to this guy because you know there just weren't a lot of Japanese veterans who had experienced combat after the Second World War. Like just a quick Google search will tell you like any major battles that went on, there were very few survivors.
Mm-hmm.
Just because of the Bushido code and like that, and like the Marines just didn't take a lot of prisoners.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so the fact that I got to speak to a Japanese soldier was very eye opening. It was very interesting, especially being a Marine myself. Like, you know, like we look at our World War II veterans, like the Tarawa guys, Iwo Jima guys, we
Mm-hmm.
look at them as gods.
Yeah.
But we don't often think about their enemy on a personal level.
Mm-hmm.
And so to speak to one of the enemy was very interesting. And he was a very respectful, elderly gentleman. He has since passed away,
Mm-hmm.
but it was very interesting speaking to him. And then speaking to another Marine.
Mm-hmm.
This was actually after the war.
Mm-hmm.
So there were a bunch of Japanese renegades, is what he called them. They were holdouts who did not surrender.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't remember off the top of my head what island it was. I think it might have been the Philippines or something like that. But their job was, he said, his job was literally that of an exterminator.
Mm-hmm.
And so they would go through the jungles, find little camps of Japanese soldiers, and literally just gun them down. They
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't take them as prisoners because they weren't going to surrender. You know, they
Mm-hmm.
were the renegades who had refused to surrender already. So their orders were, if you find them, you kill them.
Mm-hmm.
And so he told me a story about how they would form a horseshoe shape around like a camp that they would find, and that they were all armed with like Thompson submachine guns, and that like the squad leader would give the signal and they would all just jump up from the bushes and just gun everyone down.
Mm-hmm.
And he told me he remembers one guy that they almost blew like his arm off and he was still alive, and so he went up and alleviated the pain of
Yeah.
the wounded,
Mm-hmm.
and he was going through his pockets and he found a picture of the guy's wife and a child.
Yeah.
And he said that at that point, like all of the war had kind of like washed away from them. Where like these are like the, you know,
Yeah.
like our enemy and stuff, like holy shit, this is a human being.
Yeah.
And he said like years later it like tormented him,
Mm-hmm.
and that like he never got the help that he needed from the VA and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And this was like in the 80s
Yeah.
that he was like talking about it,
Yeah.
and that was another story that was like,
Yeah.
wow, like,
Yeah,
and
I
then
can't imagine that with just with like, especially, well, actually I can't imagine, but I mean like especially when there's such an end to the war. You know what I mean? It's like war's over, homie. Like, like we don't want to do this.
yeah,
Like, why stop? Like, and now you're dead. Like the war is over. Your emperor said it's over. It's all over. That I could see where that would be heart wrenching. Where you're just kind of like, dude, we didn't have to mow you down. And
yeah, like
and
this
end it.
didn't have to
This didn't
happen.
have to. It's like one thing when you're in the fight. It's another to be like, just give it up, man. You could have gone home. That I could see that would tear at somebody. But what you do is you bury that down with alcohol, and you never bring it up ever again. You
Yeah.
bury that emotion down. You let it. You just that's it, and you just let it be. Just
Hmm.
kidding. Don't do
Yeah,
that.
there's just so many stories from like the Second World War
Yeah.
that just have me floored
Hmm.
when I speak to people like that. There was another one I'll bring up really quick. He was Hitler Youth.
Hmm.
Um, during the Battle of Berlin, he was like 9 years old, and his older brother was like 11,
Hmm.
I think, and they were tank busters. So they would walk around
Jesus.
with like Panzerfausts and just shoot them at T-34s in Berlin. And so they lost the war, obviously.
Hmm.
And he was telling me how like a few years later they were on the wrong side of the wall in Berlin,
Hmm.
or not, there was no wall then, but like the wrong side of the occupied zone,
Yeah.
and that German civilians weren't getting enough to eat, and it was a very rough time
Hmm.
to grow up.
Hmm.
um, and he was talking about how he and his brother broke, and these were like, he still to this day like Heils Hitler,
Oh, so he's like
before
a diehard
for meal.
believer. Yeah.
He's still like
Yeah.
a hard, like he's still a Nazi.
Yeah.
This guy now, and he was telling me how they like jumped onto like a Russian military train to just find some food, because that was one of the better places to find it, because obviously the Soviets are going to feed their own soldiers, so
Hmm.
like military trains are a safe bet to where there's going to be some food.
Hmm.
He jumped onto the train, and they got caught by a soldier. I don't know. And his brother like tackled the guy from behind, and then he jumped on top of the Russian and like stabbed him in the chest and said like, "There's still one Nazi left in Berlin."
Oh shit.
And I was like,
And he's telling you this, like,
I was like,
yeah,
okay,
yeah,
like,
yeah,
yeah, you hear some crazy especially now that like a lot of these guys are like so close to the end, they just
yeah,
don't care
yeah,
anymore. They'll spill it all.
yeah, and that, and and part of me's, I've watched the Mossad going after, war criminals like Nazi, especially back in the
Yeah,
50s and 60s. Like those are phenomenal stories. I mean, it's insane. They go like, I think it was like Argentina, and drag back,
yeah,
the scientists and war. Like I love those. Those are amazing. Um, but there is a point, I think, to the end when they're like, yeah, you got to pay for your crimes, but at the same time, you're like, if you're in your night, like you said, that guy, like, yeah, that was, yeah, what can you say? Not by no means like piece of shit. Don't, if you,
yeah.
yeah, obviously like not condoning what he did or his beliefs, but
No,
at the end of the day, like, you probably, there's Japanese guys that survived that fucking mowed down Marines in the Pacific. Same with the Germans, and the war's over. Like, that's it. Like, your side lost. And, but I do believe going after the war criminals, the guys that actually, did all that
oh,
stuff, but
100%.
100%, but sometimes you are like, yeah, you guys old. They're like, all right, man, like you survived it. I don't know what else to say, especially if he's, I shouldn't say Hitler, especially if he said Hitler Youth, but, he's, you know, that's just insane. It's wild. But like I said, he's on his way out. So he's probably just telling you like, someone's going to document my love for
Yeah.
Hitler. Like, and you're like, oh my God. Like, okay, man, but that's wild though. I mean, to hear that, like it makes us laugh, but it is eye opening to see that other side, to see a German,
Hmm.
German youth, like it's insane, or Hitler Youth, like, and his story and surviving, on the, would have been the West Germany. Is that correct? East
I think
Germany,
so.
or
East
whatever, East
Germany.
Germany. Yeah, during the, during the Cold War. Like I said,
Hmm.
it's, yeah, yeah. But Is there any other ones that come to mind that are like just really blow you away, or is that kind of like those two the uh, the cream of the crop when it comes to hearing wild shit from you know?
As far as World War II, yeah, there's another one from the Chechen War
Hmm.
I spoke to, and this was, I don't remember the exact dates, but it was during like that massacre of Russian soldiers in Grozny.
Hmm.
Um, and this Russian was one of like the few to like escape
Hmm.
that massacre. And so I'm not like an expert in this battle or anything,
Hmm.
but basically like the Russians like tried to take the city of Grozny from the Chechens, and they had like 800 KIA. Like almost all the soldiers they sent in to the city like were killed,
Really?
and they lost something like 102 out of like the 120 tanks that they sent in, and like the equal number of like BMPs, BTRs. Like it was bloody and it was like a mess. And I spoke to this Russian soldier, um, and he was quite traumatized from this experience. And he actually had me alter it for the book, so you can actually read it in the first book,
Hmm.
like the Cliff Notes version of his story. And so what happens basically is he's on the second floor of this building, and he hears like a bunch of scuffling and like fighting going on like in the floor directly below him. And so what was happening is the Chechens were on the street, the Russians were in this building, and the Chechens had gotten into the first floor. And so they were like just brawling, I guess is what he described it
Hmm.
as, on the first floor. He comes down the stairs and there's like 3 or 4 other Russian soldiers behind him. He just kind of panics and like can't pick a target, so he just guns all of them down.
Hmm.
Like friendlies, enemies, like all of them just dead. And so they're like sitting there a couple minutes later trying to like render aid, and then more Chechens come through the doorway, and the Russians like shoot the Chechen like in the face, and then like the blood gets on the second one, and then it's like he told me like he remembers like the sound of like a knife like piercing like really taut like clothing. And like that's a story that
Hmm.
was like, I can't imagine
Yeah, yeah.
what that was like.
And so did you? So kind of going through all these stories, like World War II is pretty common. Everyone knows a lot of those, especially there's a lot of historical books written on that. Those are pretty heavily covered, obviously. But
Yeah.
when you start finding like the Rhodesian Bush War, and then Grozny, in the Chechen wars. Like I've only I got an intelligence degree, and I've kind of like brushed by these topics, and I've always wanted to deep dive more into them. Have you found yourself deep diving more into these wars and kind of like, realizing like, holy shit, there's a lot of proxy wars, or there's a ton of other conflicts that are going on at any given time, in this, in the 20th century that, everybody thinks after like World War II, or it's like World War II, Korea, kind of Vietnam, and then move, in the US. But I mean, you start diving into history, you realize that it's all over the place,
There's wars going on all the time
Yeah.
everywhere.
Hmm.
Like just now, like I always like I want to go back to Ukraine, and then I also want to go to Nigeria
Hmm.
to document the war against ISIS there. I don't know if you know Abakar Afan
Hmm.
on Instagram, but he's a Nigerian special operations soldier, always uploading pictures and videos of their operations against ISIS.
Hmm.
And I've told him like, okay, someday soon I'm going to come out there and I'm just going to embed with you, and we're going to like record a week in the life of a Nigerian soldier fighting ISIS,
Hmm.
and then there's fighting going on in Burma right now, like there has been for like the last 80 years.
Yeah. Yep.
Wars like everywhere.
Hmm.
Um, and then especially through history too. Like I didn't realize like how like densely packed combat was. Like my first book is broken up into chapters by decade,
Hmm.
and there's pretty decent amount in every single decade going on somewhere in the world.
Hmm.
Like the 80s were particularly bloody, not for the United States, but there is a lot of fighting going on everywhere else.
Hmm.
Like the Iran-Iraq war, extremely bloody. I spoke to 2 soldiers from there, both Iraqi, and it was just like human history is fantastically bloody,
Hmm.
and there's a reason for it. And documenting it is just something I feel very privileged to be trusted
Hmm.
to write these stories down. And I think part of that is because I have documented so many stories.
Hmm.
Um, like Um, and an interesting way, like I find people now is like on Instagram, like story reels, I have like wanted posters.
Yeah, I've seen those.
And
Yeah.
so it's like, I would like to speak to someone fighting in Bakhmut right now, and I'll usually get like one or two hits on that like per day. Or like
Hmm.
just recently, I tried to document a lot of World War II stories, and I got like 10 German soldiers.
Hmm.
Like oh, my dad is still like he's still around. He's like 99 German Luftwaffe or something like that. So like next week, I have a phone call with a translator who's going to hook me up with a German Fallschirmjäger who fought at Monte Cassino in Italy.
Okay.
I'm going to go talk to that guy, and
Is there something like
it's
those you guys that are like their kids are reaching out to you? Yeah, clearly they follow your channel or somebody, has
mhm.
forwarded that to them. How do I mean, do you ever talk with them and like how they feel? Like you said, you got the one guy that's like says Heil Hitler before every meal. Like, what is his? Do you know like what his kids say, his grandkids say, or or like you you
His
get a.
grandson is the one who linked me up with him,
Mhm.
and his grandson described growing up with Nazis.
Oh yeah.
Like like all his like uncles were SS officers and soldiers and stuff like that.
Hmm.
And he talked about like how their like depressed outlook on the earth and like losing two world wars like stained him,
Hmm.
you know. And now this guy like runs an MMA gym, and he said he's like broken free of like the shackles of his grandfather,
Yeah.
is the way he described it,
Hmm.
you know. And he's got like a different outlook on the world, and he's actually fighting in Ukraine right now
Yeah.
against the
Yeah.
Russians. You know, he's like, but that's one part of my grandfather I couldn't
Yeah, I
shake.
was gonna say Grandpa would be proud.
Yeah.
Yeah.
um,
No, yeah, that's
yeah,
that's pretty
it's
wild.
just
Yeah,
all.
yeah. Because I sometimes you think about the families, like when people are like, "Oh, you imagine the Hitlers or not Hitler, but the other ones." God, I can't think of the name of it right now. But they actually had a documentary like "My Name Is Whatever." God, I wish it's totally blanking on me. Not Mangala, but it was like his main. Oh, Goebbels. I think it was Goebbels or something like that. Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
Goebel,
Like
yeah.
his grandkids and like kids are like they like change, but they can't escape it. Like that's your grandfather. And kind of diving into how you deal with that and how you know it's like I said, it's wild hearing it from the other side, but I can't imagine it's any different from how we feel. Like we're proud of our grandparents, like they fought what
Hmm.
they thought was a justifiable war, and then especially and the Germans, they got screwed on the First World War, and then leads into World War II. And what's wild is how good they were, like as a as tactics and strategy and technology.
Hmm.
And it's been very interesting because I kind of dove into some of those books too. When you hear about like the Germans were winning very, handily. And it really, like, even the German generals were like, we need to quit while we're ahead. Like hearing that
Yeah.
with especially like Operation Valkyrie, them like everyone knew Hitler was crazy, but no one wanted to like be the guy to be like, you just need to stop. You stop now. You have this massive empire across here. I mean, you really think about it, across, like, you imagine if they just said, and the U.S. was willing to do a peace agreement. Like they were willing to say, yeah, because everyone wants an off ramp, and I think that's something you see today in Ukraine with political commentators. They're like, Biden just needs to be the bad guy and give Russia an off ramp, and Ukrainians not going to like it. I'm like, you going to tell that to the Ukrainians? Like, you think they're gonna, like you're too far in this now. There's no off ramp for the Russians. The Ukrainians are going to keep fighting until they get to their borders to retake back into February. There's talks of Crimea, and I understand Crimea not, drawing a hard line in the sand at Crimea. Like, in 2014, it sucks, but if you're just trying to get back to let's not kick off World War III or go any crazier than it has to be. But what's your thoughts on that? I mean,
Hmm.
like, you're the ones talking Ukrainians. Like, are there, they know, I imagine that they kind of know the West is like, well, you're not fighting this, but you're giving us, just shut up and give us your tanks and we'll do the dirty work. Like, are you seeing that a little bit in the Ukrainians? Like, we're just going to keep pushing, or is there any talks of Crimea, or are they just kind of like, we need to just get back to our borders and then just call it a day, you know?
So usually when I interview Ukrainian soldiers, it's more like I'm just like pretend I'm your diary,
Yeah.
and that's where I find I get the most raw stories because
Mm-hmm.
like if I have a list of like 15 or so like pre-written out questions, and it starts basically from like what were your thoughts on the initial invasion to like what is it like to kill a person,
Mm-hmm.
and it just varies, but I always get the most vivid accounts of what it's like to do something or what they sit and think about when they've got nothing else to do. Like I'm sure like everyone like sits and stares off into space and goes somewhere else
Mm-hmm.
in their head. I want to know what they're thinking about,
Mm-hmm.
and so I tell them, like, okay, just pretend I'm your diary,
Mm-hmm.
and I always get the most raw, unfiltered stories doing that than answering like my list of questions. Um, but then one of the questions on it is like, what is your like overall opinion of the war? Like are you for it or against it? And it's like, again, like this is you will be completely anonymous. Like no one will ever know who you are, sort of thing. And 99% of the time it's like, if I have to give my life, I will.
Mm-hmm.
I would prefer to be alive, but like
Mm-hmm.
we have shed too much blood right now to let Russia just continue to occupy the areas that they occupy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, I think they're in it for the long haul. There's obviously, like some dissent among like how they're being led,
Mm-hmm.
especially among the territorial defense guys, because like they're like our National Guard, where
Yeah.
it's not, they don't have like the best training, they don't have the best equipment,
Mm-hmm.
they're kind of the
Yeah.
afterthoughts. And so I do a lot personally to like fundraise at least for like squad level stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you've seen the viral picture of the soldier in Bakhmut, Sergei or Seri, however you want to say his name,
Mm-hmm.
and he's standing in the trench with like like a tin of like beef and a spoon, and he's like covered head to toe in mud,
Mm-hmm.
and he's got his AK laying on the ramp,
Mm-hmm.
like on the parapet right
Mm-hmm.
there. And then like the next slide is like their view of no man's land, and it's all these trees that are just like shaved at the top
Mm-hmm.
from the artillery explosions. And even his view on it is like we're here and we're ready to fight,
Yeah. Yeah.
sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And he always tells me like he's excited that he has the opportunity to show Russia what Ukrainian soldiers
Mm-hmm.
are made of. And I'm just constantly blown away
Yeah.
by the stuff these guys are saying to me, because it's like I remember like going on field ops in the Marine Corps and being like, oh my god, I have like 10 more days here, I can't do this.
Yeah.
you know
Yeah.
and it's like, yeah, I'm just constantly eating humble pie
Yeah.
when I'm talking to these guys. And I think some of that is definitely like the national propaganda being like pumped into them to say these things. But on a baser level, I do believe that like a lot of them are like ready and willing to fight however long it
Yeah.
takes. And one of them made like a pretty good point to me the other day, because there's obviously like growing opposition to the United States funding this
Mm-hmm.
war, like giving Ukraine money and like weapons and all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And this guy, I think his call sign is like Black or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I talked to him. He's a platoon commander, and he said that basically the United States is destroying the Russian army and not shedding a single ounce of his blood. He's like, if like it's like a steal,
Yeah.
like a bargain. It's a bargain price they're destroying Russian army with, and it's like, just keep giving us weapons, tanks,
Yeah.
whatever. We will do the dirty work.
Yeah.
Like we don't care.
Yeah. And I think, yeah.
And I was like, oh damn,
Yeah.
pretty good argument.
Well, that was what was amazing when I went there was the resilient spirit, and I'm still in contact with the people that I worked with when I was in Lviv, and and they were the same way. They're like, at some point I might have to go pick up, because they were kind of the ones that were like, we're going to help logistics on the back end, we need to get these orphans. That was the early days in the war. Now within a few months it turned into logistics and supply runs, just because the people that need to be evacuated got evacuated. The people that are still there are going to fight, or they're going to stay in the town. It was very much minimal, other than hospitals that people need to be evac, like wounded. But in those initial weeks was like getting people to safety. And but they were
Mhm.
like, yeah, like if we, I have to go get a gun, then he's like, I'm thinking about joining up and going to the front line, because there's people there like, no, we need you back here. They were very much like, nope, we need people running supplies back here. Every role is important, but seeing that and hearing that from them, he's like, no, we're gonna go down to the last man. Like this is all out for us. There's no going back. And I think that is something like, I agree, like by all means, from I imagine they're running into some of the same issues that we kind of run into is the bureaucracy at the top, what's going on. And I mean, by all means, we weren't immune to it, all the bullshit gear that we got, or all the equipment that didn't work, or the contractors that were in bed with the generals that were sending us the some new bullshit kit that never was tested, and not getting what we needed, but just being like, hey, or not even like say wanted, but not even what we needed, but just some like who ordered this, like who thought this was a good idea, so yeah, like sending MRAPs into the mountains of Afghanistan, like what dipshit thought that was a great idea? No one ever asked for that. And they're like, oh, the IED. I was like, why don't we get some, God forbid, get some ATVs and some, and they're like, oh, no, that's just too dangerous. And I'm like, you're gonna stick us in a giant, coffin to roll off the side of a mountain, which happened. So it's I can understand those frustrations in the American government. Like I understand why American citizens are upset at the amount of money that is being, like, it's corruption. Like they're 100% skimming off the top. But at the same time, I
Mhm.
agree with your guy Black. Like I'm in the same mentality. Like, what the fuck do you care? You know, I mean, literally, it's like
This is
you're
like
getting
it's eight
a
percent of
steal.
our military budget.
Yeah, yeah,
Like that's what it's not like they're taking initial like additional tax dollars from
yeah,
the American taxpayer. This is already allocated for our defense budget.
yeah. Yeah, and that's what I mean. I think that's something that people, it's a good headline grabber. It's a good, and by all means, like I agree, there should be Overwatch. In fact, I would push for it. Like yeah, and
Mhm.
I've said I was like, these guys on the ground are not getting, they're not getting, now they finally are getting the night vision and the communications. But that first year of the war, the first 8 months, those guys didn't have shit. And
Oh, I heard horror
yeah,
stories about that in the trenches. Like how like just we took so much for granted
oh yeah,
in the Marine
yeah,
Corps. Like every single guy has a night vision optic or a thermal.
hmm
In the Marine Corps, like every single person.
hmm
And then I spoke to soldiers in the Donetsk region, and they were talking about like shooting at noises in the dark and like a ton of friendly fire casualties because they just couldn't see.
yeah,
You know, and they would have like Wagner or Spetsnaz like sneaking up to like literally within like 10 meters of their trench before they could even see them.
yeah,
And so they were throwing frags and shooting at literally anything
hmm
in the dark.
hmm
And like just one NVG can like
change the game.
make such a massive
Yeah,
difference over there.
yeah,
I've had people like literally beg me through Instagram and it's like, please help me find like a night vision optic
hmm
or a thermal or something.
yeah.
And yeah, it's just sad like how much I took for granted in the Marine
hmm
Corps, and it's like these people are literally dying because they didn't have the same gear that I was too lazy to like even give a second thought about.
Yeah, no, and I agree with you. I think that's something that I thought they probably would have had, but then, like I said, once it started coming out, you're like, oh wow, they don't have this, or even communications. And in the beginning too, we were just trying to get comms for like our own, command center when we're in Lviv, and a lot of the the Ukrainians were like, hey, we need this in the front lines, we need this, like, and yeah, you take it for granted. I think they're getting that package now. I think it's like in the last month, that was like the last aid package. I just was like bulk order night vision and communication radios. So now they're getting, but again, though, that's like something they could have used 8 months ago. Like, that's something they could use,
Mm-hmm.
not, the high Mars
Yeah.
and everything are great. I think they're doing amazing. But I think, given the javelins and all that stuff was just like, it's just balls out brutal conventional warfare. But like I said, I think going back to that, like, like what he said, it's like, look, we're just writing the check and we don't have to bleed anything for this. And we get to bleed out Russia. I mean, it's coming at the cost of Ukrainian lives. All we have to do is provide the weapons and the checks. Like that's it. Like it's like the perfect scenario, and we're seeing it play out. And it's like, it's like it's kind of like a like, hey, we're gonna do the dirty work, just keep giving us the cash, like, and like, and like I said, they're willing to fight it. It's not like they're like the Taliban where they're
Oh
like,
yeah.
or like, the Afghan army, like, oh, we might show up to work today, like it's, they're gonna fight. You might, no matter what. So it's like you might as well just keep going. I mean, they're doing the dirty work, and and I've been an advocate like from day one, but it'd be like, hey, U.S. intervention at this point, and like, whatever, fuck it, like, let's go for it. But that's the infantryman in me. That's like, no, no balls, or it's kind of like, this is what we train for. Why are you bitching out now? Like, I think everyone got soft fighting the GWAT. That's my opinion. Even the special operations guys, because after talking with, people on the ground there, you're like, you're no better. You're about as, actually about as useful as an infantryman, which is, what you need. Those guys are sleeping in trenches, don't care if you're a Navy SEAL Team 6 or whatever. Yeah, they get onto some of those special operation teams, but even those guys are just in the trenches waiting with a rocket. They might have a little bit better gear,
Oh yeah.
but
I've spoken to
that's
plenty of
it.
guys who were like Green Berets before this, and they went and joined the International Legion, and they were just sitting there in the trenches with the other
Yep.
guys,
Like,
just taking ID out.
yeah. And I'm like, I always say, I was like, it's like, as much as I love, I think soft's great. They were meant for the GWAT. They're not meant for conventional warfare. Like, there's no better friend than a squad of Marines. And I even say that in the GWAT, they're the most aggressive animals on the planet, and you're going to want a squad of Marines over, a few, hard hitting, door kicking SEALs. It does nothing in this war. But like I said, they're useful in other warfares. I think that's starting to get a rude awakening with, I was talking to my buddy about this the other day. It's like, and by now I'm not degrading anything that soft does. It's just that there are certain types of warfare to be fought, and I think a lot of people forgot about that in the GWAT. Because even with some of those bigger battles in Afghanistan, when it would go south, everyone's equal, and it doesn't matter how much time in training you had or whatever else. What mattered was how much time you had in combat and how salty you were, or your experience under fire. But a lot of those guys don't have experience being under, in a firefight for more than 2 minutes, or don't know anything more than kicking a door in. Like, what it's like to patrol for 12 hours and then get into a tick, and now you're in the tick for the next 3 hours and you haven't slept in fucking 48 hours. Those are real things that we had to go through. And I think now you're kind of seeing this within the space of Ukraine, where you're like, we need to keep our conventional warfare and the infantry are the number one asset. Like, everything supports the infantry, and that's warfare doctrine across the board. Even in
Hmm.
special operations, like, God bless them, love them, main effort is always the infantry. Everyone else supports it. And, I remember in the, my early years, everyone kind of started to forget that, especially in the Marine Corps. It's like, guys in Al Assad, they get disconnected. You're there to support the guys on the front line, and people started getting that disconnect. And I think, Ukraine, and watching these things play out, you're seeing how important it is to be sharp, and how important it is to be, to be miserable, how to train, how you're going to fight. And the Ukrainians are showing it, that, yeah, trench warfare is still a thing. Being out in the field is
Yeah,
still
very
a
much
thing.
so.
Like, you've got to know squad tactics. You're going to have to know, like, there isn't the 160th isn't coming for you. AC 130 gunships aren't coming for you. Even as an infantryman, we're not going to have F-16s dropping JDAMs. You're on your own. You might be able to call in artillery, like, and even with drone warfare, you're seeing, it's that's how they're doing call for fire. That's how they're identifying, but they're still duking it out, and I think it's just amazing to see this play out, because for the last 20 years, I was at division headquarters in the National Guard, and everyone's like, oh, we're going to be this crazy, we're going to do this maneuver, and we're going to use this drone, blah, blah, blah. And then you're seeing things play out against, granted, Russia as a world power. Granted, it was interesting and very insightful to see how incompetent their military was. But the tactics are still brutal, and the tactics still work. Is throwing as many bodies at the enemy as much as you can to wear them down. And as much as that is, whatever you want to say is unethical or not moral, they don't care, you know. And Ukrainians are the ones fighting that. And so you're seeing all these things play out that people kind of, were like, maybe in theory, maybe they thought they could game the game. And, here we are a year later into this, into this fight. And also, the rules are off the table. You're seeing war crimes. You're seeing, willing to do anything to win. And so, you know, to challenge the U.S. military, like, are you going to do anything to win? Like, if you get dragged into this war, what are you willing to do to win? You know, um, but I foresee us staying out of it and just, maybe I'm wrong, but I might eat my words here soon. But you're seeing, you're seeing it play out with, Ukraine and how important it is to train as a, conventional army, especially with, the Marine Corps and, the Army there. It was, like I said, interesting. They started, like, especially with drone warfare, you started seeing integration of drones now into maneuvers, and it's like, yeah, you're seeing this play out and how important they are, even at the squad level. We've talked about that for years.
Yeah, I remember one of my last years active duty, they were trying to incorporate like drones on a squad level, and I thought, oh, that's silly.
Mm-hmm.
Like we're gonna have a whole guy whose job is just to fly around like a commercial drone, but now it's like that's so like ridiculously important.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
now I wouldn't feel like I've documented enough stories where I would not feel safe
Mm-hmm.
if I didn't have a guy flying around a
Mm-hmm.
drone.
Yeah, and that's the thing too is.
It's just become so like integral as just part of being an infantryman.
Mm-hmm.
Like I've spoken to drone operators who literally just drop grenades on soldiers who have like upwards of like 50
Yeah,
kills.
yeah.
And it's like
It's
that is like
wow. Yeah.
it's like that jump in technology where it's like okay, like it's like that jump in tactics and where it's like okay, now we have machine
Yeah.
guns. Now that's what the drone has done is it's just kicked it up a
Mm-hmm.
level
Yeah, and that's
because you're never safe.
yeah, and that's the thing I read from your stuff is what's amazing is how scared people are that they're like the drones because you don't hear the little bastards. And it was funny as you talk about that when you're like, oh, these drones, they're trying to implement them when you were in. And I started getting in the drones in 2014. And I ended up going to Kuwait in the National Guard, but there was a rumor that we might head to Afghanistan. And I was like, oh my God, like I am bringing my drone. Like I was like, I couldn't imagine in 2009 having this DJI drone. Like this is a game changer. I was like, this is an absolute game changer. And granted, I was a little more educated on what drones could do. Like if you're not in the drone world, you're like, it's a fucking takes photos and video. But like I was already into the industrial drones by that point, by I think 2016, 17, so it was, definitely like, I was like, oh man, I hope I can go to Afghanistan and I knew exactly what drone I was going to buy and, and use for, going out on patrols. Cause it was just the Mavics had come out by that point and you're just like, this thing folds up and I can just throw this out and I can go map an area. Like I knew how to map with those small drones. I could go in and we could map a territory and then we, could go in and check out, like zoom in with the optics and see, it's just a rudimentary drone, but it could do so much.
Mm.
And you're right. Now you're seeing it play out, in Ukraine, and it's just like, oh my God, like this is insane to even see and talk about. And I'm seeing the FPV drones now. Like all these concepts. A good friend of mine I'm still working with on some of these kind of side projects. We came up with that concept and tried pitching it to the CIA. We called it the one-way ticket, but now they're using it in Ukraine. Obviously, it's basically an FPV drone with a fucking rocket
Mm-hmm.
attached to it. And they're you're seeing them do utilize these tactics, and it's insane to see, but it's also like everyone's learning new tactics. And I think that's what's great what you're doing with Battles and Beers is there's infantrymen right now, I guarantee, in the Army and Marine Corps that are reading that line for line, because if something goes sideways and we enter this war in the next few months, those guys are 100% going to be looking at your page to be like, what are we going to expect? What's life on the ground? Because this is only a few months old and the guys we're going to meet on the ground are probably in these, within these pages. So, like, has anyone reached out to you from, I don't want to say higher command, but has anybody even remotely kind of like from the US government, like, hey, you have all this information, granted, obviously they haven't,
Several.
several. Yeah.
Several, yeah. I won't give like details on who and what, but SOI West and East have reached out about their to like expand like the like ITB SOI
Mm-hmm.
to include drones, and I put them in touch with some drone operators in Bakhmut.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and just regular like, and I've been very impressed with like the like junior NCOs
Hmm.
reaching out. So like corporals and sergeants reaching out to me asking like, hey, like, are there any equivalents, like my rank equivalent to talk to in Ukraine that I can like pick their brain and teach guys about that? I've had like probably 100 of them,
Yeah.
like junior Marines, like corporals and stuff, reach out to me and ask, and I've connected them with Ukrainian guys, and there's definitely like an information exchange, and it's really cool to see. And Ukraine at the moment is definitely the most combat experienced military on
Yeah.
Earth.
Yeah. I
Like, and that's the crazy. They're not the most competent. I will say they're not the most
mhm.
competent, but they're definitely the most combat
Yeah.
experienced. Um, and it's crazy because I speak to them, and it's like talking to guys in World War II all over
Hmm.
again.
Yeah.
Um, I've talked to like 19-year-olds who have 5 Russian tank kills under their belt, and it's like you're a tank ace. Like
Mhm.
you killed 5 tanks. That's like hundreds of millions worth of dollars of equipment you've destroyed, and you're 19 years
Yeah.
old.
Yeah.
And it's like,
It's
yeah,
it's
you
it's
know,
so insane to see. Like like I said, we would never dreamt of this. In your wildest dreams, when I was infantry, you're like, oh my
no,
god, I would love to go toe to toe conventional. Because we all think that way. We're all trained that way. Like we're gonna go.
I thought that way too.
Like
And then I spoke to guys in Mariupol
yeah,
and Moshun and now Bakhmut and Severodonetsk, and it's like I'm so glad I did not get what I wished
yeah,
for.
yeah.
Um, just listening to these, like I said, like everyone that I've spoken to is willing to fight,
Hmm.
but it doesn't mean that they're all not
Yeah,
terrified.
yeah.
Um, I've spoken to guys who admit to me that like when they know that they're going back on the line, that they like find a basement to sit in and cry
Hmm.
because they're like God, like we're going back,
Hmm.
and it's like the I was told that the frontline life expectancy for a soldier in Bakhmut right now is 8 hours,
No shit.
and it's like that's like such a depressing like statistic to think about.
Hmm.
And this is like probably the largest and bloodiest and most significant battle to happen in the last like 20 years.
Hmm.
And it's kind of like coming to like an apex right now. Like the city is about to get surrounded, and we're just kind of like seeing how it plays out. Like, does the Ukrainian army like pull a win out of their ass right now, or like do they tactically retreat from the city, or is it going to be another Stalingrad where the troops who are there right now get encircled and they're there until they run out of ammunition or food?
Hmm.
And, and that reminds me of speaking to guys inside of Azovstal
Yeah.
in Mariupol. I spoke to a lot of the soldiers there, and one guy I'll never forget. His name is Anton Krill, and I interviewed him pretty extensively. And he was killed on May 14th. But I remember um, uh, he basically summed it up that everyone he was serving with was willing to
Hmm.
die, right? So they were willing to fight to the last man, but they were not willing to just rot and wither away into
Hmm.
nothing, which was what was
Hmm.
happening at the end. There, they were eating like dog food and like drinking water out of puddles and stuff like that. But they were still not surrender. They still did not surrender until they were ordered to.
Hmm.
And like they got desperate enough where like they'd send out like raiding parties out of the factory to go find positions of Russians who were like just being complacent and like killing them and taking their food and
Hmm.
ammunition, you know. And Anton was killed on one of those like raids. A drone got
Hmm.
him, and he's a guy I'm always going to remember. He brought it up he described it very well. I was like, they're all willing to fight and to die in battle as soldiers,
Hmm.
as they do, but they were not willing to just be surrounded and like slowly
Hmm.
starve and have that like glory taken from
Hmm.
them,
Yeah.
which is how it was at the end. Like you
Yeah.
see pictures of those guys and they were
Yeah. Oh yeah.
starving.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. That was
I
yeah.
spoke to a lot of them, and I met a lot of them that had been released from captivity, and you could Azovstal will never leave them.
Hmm. Yeah.
One guy, he told me he keeps a glass of water on his kitchen table all the time.
Hmm.
So he could, because there was a time that he would have given like every penny in his bank account
Hmm.
for this one clean glass of water.
Yeah.
And now he keeps one on the table just to remember how bad things could be.
Yeah.
And that's another really humbling
Hmm.
thing to me. Um, and it's it's a testament to technology as well, because I'm sure like everyone's heard of the Battle of Stalingrad and stuff like that. And I remember like reading like books and letters and stuff from soldiers during that, and it's like I wonder what that would have been like, you
Hmm.
know. And now here I am in like April, May of last year, like literally speaking to like the modern equivalent of the Battle of Stalingrad, and it's like, wow, like this is
Yeah.
some seriously depressing
Hmm.
stuff. But I always admired like how well they handled
Hmm.
that. I always try to think like I think that's one of the big interests in people, like why they follow my page,
Hmm.
is it's like what it's like to endure these things. That's what I think people are interested in,
Hmm.
is like what is it like to be shelled for 20 hours a day? What's it like to be like wounded? What's it like to kill another human being? I think those are the reasons why people follow, is because they want to know.
Hmm.
And I always like, at least for me, like when I watch like a war movie or like a horror movie, I always think, what would I do?
Hmm.
You know, like how would I endure these things? And just speaking to these people, they're telling things to me, and it's like I don't know if I could.
Hmm.
You know, I don't know if I could endure 20 hours of shelling a day. I don't know if I could endure being told to get out of my trench and go that way towards Russian machine gun
Hmm.
fire, you know? Like I don't know.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the like that's the biggest reason like people are drawn to Battles and Beers, is because those are bite-sized pieces of what it is like to endure those
Hmm.
things.
Yeah. And it's just giving that little bit of that insight in modern times
Hmm.
that, like I said, we grew up hearing about those heroics and those, all these battles. And then now you're seeing it play out in Ukraine, and, and everyone's focused on it, the whole world. And I think that's such a weird, I don't know if the weird is the word for it, but everyone's focused on it because it's such an important fight, as much as people want to go about, we go about our daily lives. Like we fought the GWOT for 20 years and everyone went about their daily lives, but Ukraine is on their mind because, especially in Europe and Poland. I'm sure when you went through Poland, they're on edge. They got the Patriot
Yeah.
missile systems. They're ready to rock and roll. They're committed 100%. And they're seeing how this plays out, and I think that's why so many, like I said, we are taking the most of the cost, but at the same time, it's not like the European countries aren't willing to step up, because they're going to be next, or they're going to have to be the ones that, might have to send people in or do something, because we're going to, keep our distance, we just are like, but we'll keep sending the tanks, and, so it feels like one of those things where, you know, eh, there's way more in it for, obviously, for Europeans, just for proximity purposes, and to see everything play out. I mean, we here in Minnesota, we team up with the Estonians, our National Guard guys. So they go over to Estonia, and it's like, holy shit, if Ukraine is barely holding on, especially like in those early days, it's like Estonia is looking at it, they're like, we can't last a day. Like, it's just the sheer size, and like they don't have the manpower. And at least Ukraine was, I don't want to say somewhat prepared, but is that something too that did you ever come across where with Maripol and Asvaz, or sorry, um,
As of
as
small.
yeah, I can't pronounce it. Jesus, yeah, I had issues when I was there
That's okay.
pronouncing everything. Like it's when people are like we're,
Oh, it's tough,
yeah,
man.
yeah, yeah. I always pronounce it wrong too, but um, going and were they, I feel like it was not a surprise, but it was a surprise. Were they a bit bum rushed? Because sometimes they talk about the tactics where, Maripol was basically a holdout to help bleed the Russians out. Like they knew it wasn't going to hold, at some point, and same with the factories. The factories was almost to bleed it out. Did you ever hear anything from like Aiden? It's kind of like, same with what's going on in Bakhmut. They're trying to keep it, but or what point does it turn into bleed the Russians out as much as they can? Over, do we do a tactical retreat? Or do we hold this no matter what? It's, do they kind of know that in the early days? Because there was times, where they could tactically retreat, they tactically retreated. But Maripol was just one of those things where, like I said, we were in touch with a guy who was there, and he was killed within the first 2 weeks because the fighting was so intense. Was there a point where they knew that this was not I will say a lost cause, but basically your job is to stay back and kill as many Russians as you can before surrendering. Was there any thought that they were there for that, or did they think there was going to be a breakout at some point, or any type of scenario like that?
So the at least for Mariupol, from the soldiers that I've spoken with, is that they kind of knew they were going to get surrounded, and that their job was to really like tie down like a whole army group
Mm-hmm.
of Russians, which they did.
Mm-hmm.
There were a large percentage of Russian forces in southern Ukraine who were not available to help in other parts of the front line because they were dealing with the soldiers in Mariupol. Um, and like regiments like the Azov regiment, they definitely foresaw this war coming and they had
Mm-hmm.
prepared. They had like stockpiles of ammunition, food, water, stuff like that. But that stuff only goes so far when you're trying to feed like 10,000
Yeah.
people and you got 10,000 guys like firing dozens of magazines a
Mm-hmm.
day. Um, but there were definitely a lot of units early on in the war from the Russian side that were literally
Mm-hmm.
decimated. Like almost all the VDV soldiers who landed at the airport
Mm-hmm.
gone. Spoke to the now famous VDV deserter Pavel Filatyev.
Mm-hmm.
He was fighting in the south, I believe, and like he told me like his entire unit was like
Mm-hmm.
destroyed. Um, and so they're definitely like the cream of the crop, like airborne units, just
Yeah.
gone. A lot of Spetsnaz units, just they're Spetsnaz in name
Yeah.
only. I interviewed a few Western guys. One of them, two of them are former
Mm-hmm.
Marines. One is a South African. I'm sure you've seen at least a South African on my Instagram page. He got shrapnel in his
Yeah. I
jaw.
think. Yep.
Yeah, they're just regular Marines, and they fought Spetsnaz literally point
Mm-hmm.
blank. They could hear them speaking,
Mm-hmm.
and they were more aggressive, better trained, better equipped than like
Mm-hmm.
Spetsnaz. Like they're in Call of Duty games where it's like they're the cool guys of the Russian army, and
Mm-hmm.
like they were just getting stomped by these
Mm-hmm.
guys who were just basically basic infantrymen in the Marine
Mm-hmm.
Corps. You know, um, so yeah, I definitely in Bakhmut is hard because at least in terms of like what their mission is, I think it's definitely part propaganda. Like Zelensky has already said, like, okay, they're not going to give up Bakhmut because it's a propaganda win if they do hold on to it. It's a huge propaganda win.
Yeah.
It's a big blow to Russian morale where it's like you can't even take Bakhmut,
Mm-hmm.
sort of thing. Um, and then I think it is a large part of like just holding down Russian forces on the internet. I see in the comments of like B&B, it's like, oh, the Ukrainians are getting stomped by the Russians right now, and it's like, okay, like name one other front line other than Bakhmut where gains are being
Mm-hmm.
made.
Yeah.
Like the Russians lost Kherson, they lost Kharkiv, they
Yeah.
lost Lemon.
Yep.
Um, like it's like the propaganda and the enormous troll farms that come out on the
Mm-hmm.
internet are just so frustrating to
Yeah.
me. And it's like I don't know.
So what do you think then? Like in I should say in generalities, but like kind of like where do you think this war is going, and like what's your prediction? Because you have the most insight with everybody on the ground, commanders, the feel for
That's
it. Like,
the
what's your kind of
that's the
yeah.
tough thing is there's definitely I think a large Russian offensive coming. Um, so I've got like a man on the inside in Russia right
Mm-hmm.
now. He's a foreign exchange student living in Russia, and he's currently like conducting interviews on my
Mm-hmm.
behalf because he's a big like airsofter,
Oh yeah.
and so he goes to these airsoft events where like Russian soldiers are. And he like interviews them on my behalf and a bunch of them. So basically how it works is like if you're like a seasoned Russian soldier and you get wounded, you won't get sent back to the front line right away. You'll go like on like a B billet
Mm-hmm.
sort of thing, and you'll go to like their version of like the school of
Mm-hmm.
infantry, and you'll train guys. And he's telling me like they've just been training like thousands of
Yeah.
conscripts, and like that big like conscript drop in I think it was September of this last year, like where Putin conscripted like 300,000
Mm-hmm.
soldiers. Now most of them have had 4 months to train, and a lot of their like tanks and stuff that were damaged earlier in the war getting repaired, BTRs, BMPs, all this equipment, and it's going to be. I think it's going to be used for another push, probably on Kiev.
Hmm.
And then if I were the Russians, I would try to take Lviv
Yeah.
because Lviv is where all the aid is coming through.
Hmm.
Like if you take the western side of Ukraine, like the rest of it's not gonna
Yeah.
like. There's no way to aid like help them,
Yeah.
and
That's
so
what we were always concerned for when we were in Lviv was like any day they could invade, and we were kind of
yep,
surprised they didn't. But then I know again in those early years or those early weeks was like the world was like, what the fuck you guys doing? Like even like Belarus was
yeah,
like, I don't know, like this isn't good. Like we are allies, but we don't know if we want to launch from here. Like everyone was on edge, you know, um, and when we were there too, it's like, well, you cut off Lviv, you cut off everything, but at the same note, as you say, like I agree with you tactics wise, but I think that might be a bridge too far now because there's a
I definitely
yeah,
think
just with
it's a bridge too
yeah,
far.
with the time.
That's the other
Yeah.
thing about this war is it's so like impossible to
Yeah,
predict.
yeah.
Like
Mhm.
like I keeps me up at night thinking like how's this going to
Yeah.
end? Like or what's the next month even going to look
Mhm.
like? And I remember I rushed my last trip in November. I was talking to my buddy Viking, and I was like, I was like, originally going to come out in September, and he's like, dude, war might be over by Christmas.
Mhm.
Like this, like huge, like Ukrainian offensive in the east and the south was very successful. It looked like the Russian army like was broken,
Mhm.
um, and so like the mood in the air was very like,
Yeah, this might be over
uh,
by then. Yeah.
yeah, this might be over sooner than we think.
Mhm.
And now it's like obviously
Yeah.
it's not going to be over for a while. Like the Russians have proved and shown that like okay, we're willing to absorb a large amount of casualties. We're not going to
Yeah.
stop. Um, and you can see that just by Bakhmut,
Mhm.
right? Like the Battle of Bakhmut, where it's literally a city that people will argue about like the significance of it, and the fact that people are arguing over if it is significant or not kind of tells me that it's like okay, it's probably not that significant if it like there's an argument going on about
Mhm.
it. And it's like they're losing thousands of soldiers to like take this city, and it's just Bakhmut.
Yeah.
Like it's not Kiev, it's not Kherson,
Mhm.
it's not Kharkiv, it's not Lviv,
Mhm.
it's just Bakhmut.
Yeah.
And I would argue that probably 10 to 20,000 Russian soldiers have died so far
Jesus.
assaulting that
That's
city.
insane.
Yeah, yeah. And like I don't know, man. I get some of the pictures that get sent to me too
Mhm.
from there are absolutely like
Mhm.
crazy. There's a Ukrainian. I almost said a German machine gunner. There's a Ukrainian machine gunner sent me a picture of like right in front of his firing position, and there were like 30 dead
Yeah.
bodies in the no man's land, and they're like between like 5 yards and like 150 yards in front of
Mhm.
him, just like this cone of fire, and it's like that's a lot of dead
Yeah.
bodies, you know. And he's like, yeah, that was just me in like the last day. And it's like, holy
Yeah,
shit.
I mean, again, reading your stories, it helps keep people up to date of what's going on. I think, like I said, I think it's insanely important. Um, yeah. So, what's your, moving forward? What is, obviously the conflict in Ukraine is huge, but where do you think of taking Battles and Beers? And not saying you're, like you said, the journalist aspect, but I mean, you're doing probably more journalistic work than most of Western journalism right now. At least there's a lot of great guys out there, but I mean, the Instagram journalists are the ones that keep us up to date. Like if you really want the on the ground intel right away, they're either there or they have sources reporting back, and you check your page and other pages like it. You know, are you kind of not saying taking this to a bigger scale, but are you thinking about doing more, like you said, going to Nigeria, or obviously keeping up with Ukraine? I mean, that's all kind of all personal and close to us. I know you went, and you're planning on going again, and whatnot, and I'm still involved. Is there something that you plan on seeing Battles and Beers going?
See, that's the difficult part is I have no idea.
Hmm.
Like I said earlier on, I kind of just fell into B&B. Um, what I've been doing. Like my last trip to Ukraine, I took a bunch of pictures, did a bunch of interviews, and I got them all on camera.
Hmm.
And so I still have all of this footage. I don't know what I'm doing with it yet.
Hmm.
Um, I might try to make like a amateur documentary, at least with Ukraine. But like as far as B is concerned, I plan to just keep doing what I'm doing and just grow the following as much as I can.
Hmm.
Because the bigger I get, the more leads I get on
Hmm.
stories. And so I'll spend anywhere from 4 to 10 hours a day working on B&B
Hmm.
stuff, whether that's like sending out messages to potential
Hmm.
leads or conducting interviews, stuff like that.
Hmm.
Like right before I hopped on with you, I was literally in the shower, like holding my phone outside of the curtain,
Yeah.
texting a guy on when he was free next Monday for like a video
Hmm.
call, you know, because he's like a Ukrainian conscript who's just finished his training and going east. And so I want to talk to him about his feelings on the eve of going into
Hmm.
combat, because I think that's another thing that doesn't get documented either is like the before,
Yeah. Yeah.
like before
Yeah.
bang.
Hmm. God, it's great you
So yeah,
say that
the
stuff. Yeah.
future of B&B is, it's, I will say the future of B&B is like the timeline of the war in
Hmm.
Ukraine. It's something I can't predict it
Yeah.
either.
Yeah. That's awesome, man. Well, I mean, I appreciate the call. I appreciate that doing this podcast with me today.
Mhm.
Thanks for coming on, and we'll definitely keep in touch. And is there where
Yeah,
can,
thanks for
yeah,
having me.
absolutely. Where can people find you? And then where can they purchase your book and everything else?
So people can find me primarily on Instagram. It's just at battles.and.beers. So battles and beers. I've got a backup page that shows up. I'm pretty shadow banned for some reason. Can't imagine why. You can also find my personal Instagram. It's Nick Laidlaw. You can check it out there. And then I've got link trees on all three accounts to find my books on Amazon. So if you want to buy a book, support me and help me do what I do. Like I said, I work full time, go to school full time, and I basically do B&B full
Mhm.
time as well. So yeah, I'm easy to find.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you being on the podcast, and thanks for the interview. This was great.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me.